You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi everyone, this is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for August 30th, 2019. This week I'm talking digital health, a new LDL cholesterol lowering drug, PCSK9 inhibitor evidence, and an ESC preview. But I want to first start with a correction. Last week, I made a mistake. An astute listener messaged me on Twitter and said that while I was discussing the BEAT-HF trial, I said P-wave instead of P-value. Now, I'm mildly sad that I erred, but I'm extremely happy that I have astute listeners. So thanks for listening, and remember, if you like this podcast, please tell your friends, subscribe, and consider giving us a rating and review so that others can find us. The first topic today is digital health. I see a lot of patients nowadays wearing Fitbits, and the Fitbit company has won a contract with the Singapore government to provide their fitness trackers and services to about 1 million citizens as part of a, quote, health initiative. The trackers will be free, but on the condition that users will spend the equivalent of $7 per month, and these $7 users get health advice and nudges about better eating and sleeping and exercise. Now, Singapore has about 5.6 million people and also the longest life expectancy in the world, as well as a health system that's lauded by health economists for its fusion of both liberal and conservative ideas. Singapore, I learned, has a truly universal health insurance system, and it's based on the idea that patients, not insurers, should bear the cost of routine care. It's a largely state-run healthcare system where the government designed the insurance products with a healthy appreciation for free market principles. And the government acts to keep costs low and then uses those low costs to make a market-driven insurance possible. Now, 2 comments here. This story makes the podcast to highlight the notion that heart rhythm screening is happening whether we like it or not. This isn't like cancer or vascular screening programs which we control. The point is that clinicians are going to have to grapple with this extra data. Second thing is, this is a huge policy experiment that may or may not work. But perhaps in Singapore, where individuals have more financial responsibility for their own health, digital nudges might help. But as many of you know, I remain doubtful that this sort of health screening with heart rate monitors will help patients, but I'm almost certain it helps the makers of digital devices. Digitizing the human condition sounds more like dystopia than utopia to me. Now, second topic is a new drug for LDL lowering that is getting close. Sadly, it's a little hard to pronounce. It's called inclisiran. It's a small interfering RNA therapy designed to target PCSK9 messenger RNA. The drug lowers LDL by using RNA interference to inhibit PCSK9 synthesis. And a couple of years ago, in 2017, a phase 2 study published in the New England Journal reported substantial reductions of LDL, and nearly half the patients who got this drug had LDL cholesterols less than 50. This week, we learned from a company press release that the phase 3 Orion 11 study met all its primary and secondary endpoints with LDL cholesterol lowering capacity that was consistent with that seen in the phase 1 and 2 studies. Now, Orion 11 is the first of 3 phase 3 regulatory trials, and it had about 1,500 patients with documented vascular disease and elevated LDL despite maximum tolerated statins. But here is the novel feature of this drug. Get this. Patients get a baseline injection, then one at 3 months, then every 6 months thereafter. There's no pill burden at all. That's novel. Now, the primary endpoint of Orion 11, however, was not an outcomes primary endpoint. It was a % change of LDL from baseline to 17 months. And the press release also noted that the drug was well tolerated, and it confirmed safety profile was, quote, at least as favorable as the earlier Orion studies. The full report will come at ESC, and this story makes the podcast because of the drug's novel delivery, yet we still have to wait. LDL cholesterol is not a good enough endpoint. The next step is to document reduction in cardiovascular outcomes and also to confirm longer-term safety. The third topic today concerns two sub-studies of the Odyssey trial that were both published in JACC. Now recall that Odyssey Outcomes, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2018, was a large RCT with nearly 19,000 patients who had had acute coronary syndrome, ACS, within the first 1 to 12 months before, and had had LDL cholesterol of at least greater than 70, a non-HDL of greater than 100, or an ApoB of greater than 80, while taking high-intensity statins or max-dose statins, and it was randomized to either alirocumab or placebo. And over a mean follow-up of nearly 3 years, the PCSK9 inhibitor reduced the composite primary endpoint of coronary death, MI, stroke, or unstable angina by 1.6% in absolute terms. Now, this 15% relative risk reduction met statistical significance. The death rate in the large trial was 0.6% lower in the active arm, but because this was one of the many hierarchical endpoints, the authors did not perform p-testing on it. This week in JACC, Odyssey authors present two pre-specified sub-analyses, one looking at the results of alirocumab in patients with vascular disease in multiple beds. The beds being coronary bed, peripheral bed, and cerebrovascular bed. And the other sub-study centered on drug efficacy depending on the CABG history or coronary bypass history. I first want to compliment journalist Deborah Beck, whose news recap includes this lead line in the third paragraph of the story. Quote, any subgroup analyses, including ours, which were pre-specified, have to be taken with a grain of salt because the study, of course, wasn't powered to see these subgroup differences. And I love this, and I think we need more news features with these sorts of disclaimers early on in the column. For the first analyses, the authors split the cohort into three groups. 17,000 of the nearly 19,000 patients had disease only in the coronary tree. Another 1,400 had disease in two beds, either the coronary vascular bed or the cerebrovascular bed or peripheral vascular disease bed. And 149 patients had disease in all three vascular beds. Then the authors looked at outcomes in these three groups, and indeed, the absolute risk reduction in major adverse cardiac outcomes was 1.4% with just coronary disease, 1.9% reduction in those with disease in two vascular beds, and 13% in those with disease in the three beds. Overall reductions in death showed the same gradient. Bottom line, the more vascular disease, the more the benefit of the PCSK9 inhibitor. The authors also note in the discussion of this paper that Fourier authors have published a similar gradient of benefit with the PCSK9 drug evolocumab. Now, the second Odyssey analysis follows the same sort of plan. Here, the authors separate the groups by CABG status. 17,000 patients had not had bypass. About 1,000 had index CABG at the time of their qualifying acute coronary syndrome, and about 1,000 had CABG well before they entered the trial. And here, the drug had a much lower absolute risk reduction in the group that had had bypass surgery well before the qualifying event, again suggesting the larger the burden of disease, the more the benefit of the drug. So taken together, these are not surprising results. If you assume a relative risk reduction with LDL cholesterol lowering from the PCSK9 molecule, then if you start at a higher risk, the degree of absolute risk reduction will be larger. I had a patient recently who really fits this plan. He had a recent ACS-like event. He had a high LDL and absolutely could not tolerate statins. He was pretty fit. He ate pretty well, took his blood pressure medicines. And in days of old, this person would have likely suffered more cardiac events and ultimately done poorly over time due to this heart disease. But now, perhaps if we can get this drug covered more easily, PCSK9 inhibition offers him a real shot of having lower outcomes going forward. While most people can get to goal with high-intensity statins, some cannot, and I would call the development of PCSK9 drugs a really strong advance. I qualify that a bit, though, because we don't have safety data on these drugs longer than 3 years. Finally, an ESC preview. Now, the ESC Congress, the European Society of Cardiology Congress, begins this Saturday, and unlike American cardiology meetings, which have been shortened due in part to docs not being able to get away, ESC remains a 5-day meeting with more than 30,000 attendees. And if you've never been, it's really shocking how big this meeting is. Steve Stiles has a detailed news preview up on the site, and I also have a preview column. The first day of Hotline trials features a number of studies that have come with press releases that have already hinted at the results. And the big one, obviously, is Paragon-HF, which compared sacubitril/valsartan to valsartan alone in patients with heart failure and preserved ejection fraction. The press release said it narrowly missed its primary endpoint. And gosh, this would have been huge, as heart failure with preserved ejection fraction is such a major problem. But given the scope of this condition and the financial stakes for Novartis, we will all need to have our spin detectors tuned to very high. Then there is the DAPA-HF study. Now, the SGLT2 inhibitor drugs have been shown to be associated with weight loss and diuresis when given to patients with diabetes. Now, DAPA-HF boldly studied the drug in patients with heart failure, but did not limit the study to diabetic patients. We know from a press release that the trial met its primary endpoint and was clinically meaningful. This could be a paradigm-changing trial presentation. The prolific trialist, Professor Deepak Bhatt, will present the THEMIS trial. This is a huge RCT in patients with type 2 diabetes and coronary disease that tested ticagrelor versus placebo. Again, a press release hints at a statistically significant reduction in MACE. My friend Presh Sanders from Adelaide is back in the spotlight when he presents the HELP-AF study, which is novel in that it assesses a home-based education and learning program for patients with AF. Education remains an undervalued medical intervention, so I look forward to these results. The program at ESC is full up with AF screening studies. We shall see if any of them persuade me. Here, the key is not to learn that screening picks up AFib. Of course it does. The question is, does picking up AFib improve the life of the tested? Because we know screening helps the testers. Now, there will be more info at ESC on high-sensitivity troponin. There's going to be a study on the SALT debates, acute heart failure, in combination oral anticoagulation plus antiplatelets. Finally, ESC is releasing a ton of guidelines, which I think has more impact in Europe as these documents directly influence payers' decisions. One thought on guidelines is I'd love to know if there was a way to study whether the proliferation of these documents has had a measurable effect on health outcomes. I mean, the upside of these documents is they're incredibly good evidence review and bibliography. I find them a great start in reviewing the evidence underpinning a therapy. The downside of guidelines, however, is that they can become overly prescriptive and it can inhibit true shared decision-making. For instance, the American AFib guidelines give a 1A recommendation for shared decision-making for oral anticoagulation, but the document also says anticoagulation is underused. So you can't have it both ways. You can't have both shared decision-making and an ideal uptake of a therapy. So you can respect the work the authors do on these documents. It's really incredible and it's hard work, and still be skeptical and worried about the downsides of guideline proliferation. So if you are in Paris, please say hello. I love hearing from listeners in person, even if you disagree with me. It's such an honor to know people listen to this podcast. Also, look for the amazing coverage from the professionals at the Heart.org and Medscape Cardiology. That's it for this week in cardiology. I'm grateful that you listened. Thank you. Till next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.